Let's talk about the Traveler. The Traveler, either Aether or Lumine depending on the player's choice at the start of the game, serves as the main character of Genshin Impact. It's their quest to find their lost sibling that drives the plot of the main story of the game, and they serve as the point of view character throughout basically all of the Archon quest. The story of Genshin is, ultimately, the Traveler's story. Though you wouldn't be able to tell that looking at character usage charts. Now I, unlike most Genshin players, actually built my Traveler, which is probably why I still can't 9-star floor 12 a Spiral Abyss F in chat, so I speak from personal experience when I say, they're not that strong. As much as I like to pretend that everyone is playing Genshin for the story or whatever, the undeniable truth is that Genshin is a video game, and that gameplay mechanics will factor into players' decisions to use certain characters as much as their personalities do. And as we all know, big number make brain juice go funny haha, but it's relatively hard to do the big numbers with the Traveler, and that is ultimately going to end up reflected in their usage rate. Still, obviously characterization does play a significant role in which characters players like to use. A lot of anime-flavored gachas ultimately boil down to a waifu/husbando collection simulator game, and Genshin is no exception, if we're going off the sheer amount of horny fan art that I see on twitter.com, that is. And therein lies the ultimate underlying concern, or at the very least, the concern that I wanted to talk about in this video. Let's talk about the characterization of the Traveler themselves. According to the most definitive source I could find, i.e. the first sentence of the TV tropes page that I found after doing a single Google search, a blank slate character is an empty character with no beliefs, no opinions, and no experience, ready to be shaped by the outside world. I feel like a lot of people use the term blank slate pejoratively, and it is true that in traditional media, a blank slate is normally just a boring bad character, but within an interactive medium like video games, a blank slate character isn't necessarily a bad thing. The goal of many games is player empowerment and immersion, and the use of a blank slate character can help the player more easily project themselves into the world of the game. Within this context, the blank slate character serves as less of a character in the story and more of a vehicle through which the player can experience the game in its world, steering the course of the narrative through their own decisions. Rather than just passively being told the story, by empowering the player to affect the course of the game, they have elevated the role of the player from an observer to an active participant. It is, in some sense, the ultimate catalyst for player empowerment. Of course, this is assuming that the game is providing the player with the opportunity to make meaningful choices that affect the game. If this does not hold true, if there's no way the choices the player make can meaningfully impact the game, then the utility of the blank slate falls off dramatically. After all, if the game is the same regardless of the choices of the player, then there is no means through which the player can express themselves. They are given no power to steer. Now, instead of a vehicle to explore an immersive and engaging world, the player is just going in a straight line, and they're stuck in a cardboard cutout with the personality of a stale piece of toast the whole time. Now, you might hear this and think that the optimal solution is to just write a well fleshed out main character, and while I normally agree that writing good characters is generally good advice, there are some situations where a strongly characterized protagonist can present some obstacles, for lack of a better word. If your goal is immersion, to make the player feel like they are the ones on the epic journey, then a main character with a pre-established personality and strong motivations risks alienating the player, because whatever that character wants to do isn't necessarily what the player themselves wants to do. And if the player has been hitherto immersing themselves in the world by projecting themselves onto the main character, this disconnect can break the experience. It's now clear to the player that this is not them, that they are not the ones in the world. And a lot of games try to balance these two implementations out by giving the main character a fairly inoffensive personality, slap some cookie-cutter heroics and a few well-worn, uncontroversial tropes onto a usually conventionally attractive frame, call it a day. And while this might sound good on paper, the unfortunate reality is that this solution inherits most of the problems of both of these implementations without meaningfully solving any of them. Without the ability to meaningfully act, the players who want to immerse themselves in the world of the game and affect the arc of the story will find themselves constrained, trapped within the confines of a boring character, railroaded along from one point to the next. And the players who want to experience a cool and engaging narrative will find themselves disappointed, because every part of the story is now obligatorily shackled to a kind of boring character. And this is where we find Aether Genshin Impact. Or, I guess also Lumine. I picked Aether. I'm sorry, Lumine havers. I didn't mean to, no disrespect. There's no saving that. The characterization of the Traveler is, at times, pretty indecisive. There are a lot of elements to suggest that they're meant to be something of a blank slate character. The player is allowed to select their preference of the two twins and name them, their personalities are generally flat and pretty indistinct, and their introduction as a newcomer to the world slots them appropriately into the same archetypal role as a blank slate. Their simultaneous status as the point of view character and ignorance of the world around them gives the game the perfect excuse to dump a bunch of exposition into them, and the player themselves by extension. And on the surface, you could see how they think this would work. They've created a beautiful world with a deep and rich history that they want the player to get immersed in, and a blank slate sounds like a great vehicle through which to experience it. But there are a few key problems here. I mentioned earlier that blank slates work best when the game empowers the player to meaningfully affect the trajectory of the game, and this doesn't have to be major. It can be anything from choosing which one of these hot characters to marry, to character customization, just anything that helps us immerse ourselves in the world of the game to really feel like we are the ones in control. And Genshin offers us literally none of that shit. While Genshin is ostensibly an open world game, its story is by and large pretty linear. Most parts of the story are unlocked by completing the previous part of the story, so while the player can technically go wherever they want in the world at any time, except Inazuma until they complete the story or whatever, each player will follow almost exactly the same line through the main story. In fact, to my memory at least, there's literally no choice the player can make that will have an effect on the main story at all. And, as I mentioned in the previous section, these two factors do not mesh well. Without the ability to meaningfully affect the game with our choices, what we're left with is passive observation of a predetermined narrative that now contains a sort of half-written non-character at its center. And as a vehicle for the audience to project on, while the Traveler's not enough of a character to make them broadly interesting, they are enough of a character to induce a distinction between themselves and the player in front of the screen. There's a narrative separation there. The Traveler is given a distinct history and backstory that they themselves are privy to, but the player isn't. There's a reason why amnesiac blank slates are such a common trope. If both the character and the player are unraveling the mystery of the Traveler's past in tandem, then they're in sync. But while the Traveler's backstory is framed as a mystery for the player, it's not a mystery to the Traveler, and that can be a bit dissonant. Like, you can go back and find theories from before the We Will Be Reunited questline about the Traveler's connection to Conria, that they might have witnessed his fall, or that they might even be from Conria. This was a legit mystery that players were trying to figure out. Then all of a sudden, the Traveler just rolls up to Dainsliff like, oh yeah, I was totally there, just never mentioned it. And there's an emotional separation. The Traveler's quest to find their sibling is a clear and understandable motivation for the Traveler, but the player is never given any reason to emotionally attach to the Traveler's sibling. We get a short cutscene where they both fight the unknown god, and then the moment we select one of them, the other is taken from us, and then we never see them again until the We Will Be Reunited questline. The Traveler tells us about their relationship with their sibling, but we are never shown their relationship with the sibling. We are never given the chance to feel the same attachment to their sibling that the Traveler feels. So the Traveler, at least in my subjective opinion, is the worst of both worlds. They have a distinct backstory and personality that makes it relatively difficult for the player to project themselves onto them. And even if you could project yourself onto them, the game doesn't give the player the opportunity to meaningfully affect the game at all, and the linear narrative left over by this is now bogged down by what is basically a completely milquetoast main character. So it sounds a bit like what happened here is that MiHoYo miscalculated. Structurally speaking, a game like Genshin was always going to be hard to develop any sort of branching narrative for. The game operates under a strict 6 weeks per update schedule, so any branch means that all of a sudden the next update is going to require double the amount of work. And it's hard to imagine the resulting product of that situation ending up anything but half-baked on at least one end. The structure they've chosen to release their game just makes it hard to give the player meaningful choices without screwing over like half of them. And it's not like their current model doesn't work, it's more than possible to tell a deep and compelling linear narrative if that's their goal. But if that's the case, then they might have been better off creating a main character with a bit more personality. But what if that wasn't their goal? Okay, so when I said earlier that there was only one use for a blank slate character, I lied. Well, it wasn't exactly a lie. I said there was one good use for a blank slate character. This use is, well, I wouldn't qualify it as good, but it's prevalent enough that it clearly works, and is at least proximal enough to Genshin to be relevant to the conversation. There is one genre of traditional media where the blank slate character, or at least something close to that, is alive and well. The self-insert wish fulfillment power fantasy harem anime. And to be clear, this is not me like calling out people who enjoy that sort of thing. There's nothing wrong with indulging in a bit of power fantasy nonsense every once in a while, and if that's your trash, who am I to judge? I unironically watch Fairy Ranmaru. But even the most ardent fans of the genre have to admit that they're not exactly known for being bastions of deep and immersive storytelling. There are exceptions, but most light novel adaptation power fantasy harem anime follow a pretty simple structure. You have your obligatory boring protag-kun who's fairly generic so the audience can project themselves onto him and live vicariously through him as he becomes super OP and badass, and then he gets like 17 girlfriends or whatever. Now you might hear this and think that I'm about to accuse Genshin of being a shitty isekai harem power fantasy anime game, and well, no, mostly no, sort of? Most isekai harem power fantasy anime plots tend to center around the main character, and how cool and smart and strong they are, and how much all the women in that show want in their pants to give the viewer who's projecting themselves onto the main character the biggest rush. Genshin, by contrast, has a story with plot and characters that have motivations beyond simping incredibly hard for the Traveler, so it more than easily clears the hot garbo threshold, which, great, that's where we are. Genshin is better than In Another World with my smartphone. Anyway, the point is, that's how most power fantasy isekai harem anime use the blank slate character. Generally speaking, in a TV show, you want your audience to like the characters you've written. The best way to do this is, of course, to just write good characters. Duh. But the problem with that is that it's hard. So as a quick shortcut, lots of authors just make all the female side characters extremely bangable, slap on a basic one-note personality, and make them simp for the audience insert character extremely hard, and just hope that the audience thinks with the head between their crotch and not the one on their neck. You can see where I'm going with this, right? So again, I'm not exactly saying that Genshin is an isekai power fantasy harem anime. I mean, it kind of is realistically, but it's not a bad one of those. Mostly. I won't be naming names because I'm kind of worried that if I'm too specific about it, I'll get cancelled on Twitter or something. But I am saying that, especially recently, MiHoYo has been kind of leaning into the, if we make this character simp really hard for the Traveler, maybe they'll like them. and spend money. Now, you might be hearing this and thinking to yourself, so what? I myself admitted earlier that there's nothing wrong with indulging in a bit of power fantasy every once in a while, and if miHoYo wants to weaponize that to make money, as long as it's still enjoyable enough, then what's the big deal? I'm glad you asked, theoretical viewer of this channel/video. I have two-ish problems with this style of writing. First is what this style of writing does to the character it's applied to. If a character is just simping incredibly hard for the traveler, then what they're not doing is being a character. It's boring. While I said I don't find anything wrong with power fantasy, I personally am not a fan. I prefer for the characters in the story I'm experiencing to be well-written, interesting characters. Second, and more relevant to this video, is what this style of writing does to the traveler. Like I said at the beginning of the video, the story of Genshin Impact is the story of the traveler. Our goal to find our sibling is the driving force of the narrative, and if this story is going to have any impact at all, our traveler is going to need to be an active participant. They can't be a blank slate. They need a backstory, motivations, a personality. They are going to need to be a character. So let's take a step back. I've been kind of down on isekai power fantasy stories in this video, and honestly, I want to walk that back a little bit. There's nothing inherently wrong with an isekai harem power fantasy story. Liking the main character too much is not some irredeemable narrative sin for a side character to commit or whatever. Everything that I've listed in the video before this can work. You can have a story where an OP protagonist goes on an adventure to ascend to godhood and collect a bunch of girlfriends on the way, and still call that a good, well-written story. My problem with these tropes isn't that they're inherently bad, but that authors have figured out that they work regardless of the quality of characters involved, so they don't bother most of the time. But you can totally have a story that includes these elements and works. I said earlier that I consider Mushoku Tensei to be an exception to the rule of badly written isekai harem anime, and I stand by that assertion. I think a part of what separates it from the rest of the isekai trash out there is its main character, because Rudius is a character. And what I said earlier does apply. Rudius is a strongly written character, and that did interfere a lot with my ability to project myself onto him, mostly because of how much of a perv he is. Get that maid's panties off your heads, you little shitter! But it's clear from fan response that when it works, when his character resonates with the viewer, it works really well, and despite my inability to relate with Rudius, I would agree that Mushoku Tensei is a lot better written than any of its shit billion isekai knockoffs. And if I had to choose between watching it and watching them, I'd easily pick Mushoku Tensei any day of the week. Even within the context of Genshin, Ayaka's storyline arguably lines up with a lot of what I described earlier in the video, and you know what? It's pretty good. I think Ayaka is an interesting and compelling character, and I enjoyed playing her story quest, and a big part of what I enjoyed playing about it is the fact that she's a character. She has a history and a personality and genuine motivations beyond being down bad with the Traveler. And the Traveler is a character too. Not exactly much of one granted, but it's certainly there. Their status as an outsider means they aren't intimidated by the baggage brought on by Ayaka's lofty position, and helps to expose the relatively sheltered Ayaka to new experiences. They display agency, they push Ayaka to come out of her shell, to experience new things. Hell, the writers even found some time to have them express their deep desire to reunite with their sibling. This isn't a self-insert in some personality-less girl who simps for them for the benefit of the player. This is two characters getting to know each other, becoming closer friends, and growing from the experience. And this is my real problem with the Traveler as a blank slate. We can have a Traveler who is an interesting and dynamic character in an interesting and dynamic story, or we can have a Traveler who collects bitches like they're the stones to their infinity gauntlet. It's pretty clear from the past that if the writers go with the latter, they're not going to bother with the former, and every time miHoYo falls back to using that cheap old trick, while it works to sell characters, it cheapens the overall weight of the story by reducing what should be its centerpiece to a piece of stale toast. And I honestly think miHoYo is starting to catch on a little bit. I'm not the only person who's noticed, but the Travelers started to develop a bit of a personality. They get to Inazuma and all of a sudden they're making smug faces. They're fed up with all the fetch questy bullshit. They're sick and tired of being strung along on the whims of others. They want to find their sibling. It hasn't escaped my notice that the last piece of major story content before the introduction of Inazuma was the We Will Be Reunited questline, centering around the Traveler and their narrative. I think someone at miHoYo looked at that quest and realized, if they want this story to work, they're gonna have to make the Traveler a character. Or honestly, they might have just made some new facial animations and wanted to show them off. I feel like that's more likely, actually.